Hello. So this is not really a review of Birdboy, The Forgotten Children, but there are some thoughts that I wanted to share about it. One reason I wanted to talk about it at all is that, well, I watched it and it was certainly different from a lot of other animated features that I've seen in recent years. And as far as I can tell, it doesn't seem that the movie has had a huge audience so far, at least here in the US. It doesn't seem like people have really picked up on this one too much. It was apparently originally released in 2015. It is based on a graphic novel of the same name, I think, and it comes from Spain, I believe. I don't see a ton of Spanish animation, but here we have certainly a very interesting little movie, and it is little. It runs about an hour and 15 minutes, if I remember correctly. Not super long. Barely hits some of the marks for being a feature film, in fact. And for other reasons that I'd like to get into, it almost feels like a short film in other ways too. But just on the surface, yeah, this is a movie that was recommended to me by one or two different people who come out to the streams, and yeah, I'll be discussing this on the relevant stream. But I also wanted to put together this video to release shortly afterward. And it is, I think the trailer, specifically the G-Kids trailer, I think is kind of misleading. It definitely gives you a good sense of the incredible visuals that you'll be treated to when you watch this movie. But even just the distribution, like G-Kids has the distribution rights apparently for the US at least, maybe all of North America. And for the most part, and as is implied by their name, they tend to do international animated content that is meant for children primarily. So you get stuff that's safe for kids to watch, but it's interesting generally. They have pretty good taste all around, it seems. But this one, definitely not a movie for kids. I don't care if you tend to let your kids watch some more intense stuff or some more adult material. I think that even for the average adult viewer, Birdboy is very intense, and I think it could potentially be put in the sort of misery porn film category, which is just, it's usually art house kind of stuff that's just, the whole thing is a miserable experience and it makes you feel bad. The reasoning for wanting to make audiences feel bad can differ, but the immediate result for the viewer is just, oh. And that's definitely the overall feeling I had while watching Birdboy. It doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. That's not necessarily a negative experience overall. It doesn't necessarily take away from my respect for the movie or for the visuals or the technical aspects of the animation itself, but it's also it also means that I don't really want to actively watch this again anytime soon. There's a lot so I don't think this is spoiling anything, but like just more as a heads up, this movie heavily deals with substance abuse and addiction. It deals with like familial abuse and other family issues. It is surprisingly graphically violent. There's a lot of blood and a decent amount of gore in this movie. I'm saying it's not for kids, and even for adults, like, you know best whether or not you're going to be able to manage watching this one, is what I'm saying. In terms of somewhat overlapping pieces of media or potentially influences on this movie, depending on timeline, of course, it reminded me quite a bit of Mouse, the graphic novel series from Art Spiegelman. Just in some of the character designs and movements and environments, I did also get hints of Ernest et Celestine, French movie. They deal with light in some similar ways, and there are also some backgrounds that just look clearly watercolor, which was certainly done quite a bit in that movie. It also reminded me of the video game Lisa, the painful RPG. If you know it, you know it. There were also points where, when there was less dialogue, I was reminded of Cat Soup, one of my favorite shorts from Japanese animator Masaki Yuasa. Apparently has a new movie coming out soon. I don't know. I'll have to check up on that. But yeah, I guess I can go at sort of the technical stuff first. The animation is lovely. It's certainly one of the more twitchy styles, right? Where there aren't tons of frames of movement. Not every movement is extremely smooth. And in fact, that contributes directly to characterization or just tone overall, as you'll have, sort of twitchy movements. One of my favorite little bits of animation is when they have Birdboy, the title character, when he is flying around or trying to fly around. I thought it was perfect because it was immediately appealing, just his arcs and everything and how they translated that visually. But also it's a character thing, as you'll find out when you watch the movie. Like, his sort of shaky style of flying is extremely relevant to his character and his character arc. Composition is gorgeous. Again, I feel like I haven't read the graphic novel. I would be interested to grab a copy if I can find it, just because I want to see how many of these sort of frames from the graphic novel were directly translated in the movie. I think the original author illustrator was involved in the production of this movie, so I wouldn't be surprised if they just said, you know what, we're just going to take several keyframes, or quite a few keyframes from the book, and just put them in here and then animate them. I don't have a problem with that. I don't think it's a lack of creativity or anything, and if anything, it makes it easier to believe how they were able to achieve such creative and interesting and varied composition in this movie. Really cool frames, plenty of stuff that I would gladly print out and hang on the wall. That's more or less the technical stuff. So the rest is like a sort of tone, vibe, storytelling, narrative stuff, plot, themes, all that. So as I mentioned, it hits on very serious themes, very adult stuff. There's an interesting motif of just parents in general and parentage, interactions between children and their parents, step parents in some cases, adoptive parents in other cases, almost accidentally. So it's certainly approaching a message there, even if I didn't feel like it had. I don't feel like it was trying to cram a specific message about parenting down my throat, because there's so many varied situations, varied interactions between kids and their parents, even though a lot of them tend to be pretty negative. There's also a moment early on where we get a pretty graphic, actually a really interesting image of like a toy baby Jesus who is crying blood. He's like a squeezy doll toy. And it's crying blood. He might even have a crown of thorns on him. I'll have to check. Having grown up heavily Catholic, I was like, oh, okay, we're gonna get into like Catholicism stuff now and like Orthodox religion. We didn't really. That thread was essentially abandoned very early on in the movie. Some of the characters, well, one character in particular, one female character, is pretty heavily, well, I won't say heavily sexualized, but like, I think she's supposed to be a teenager, and there's some stuff that's a little bit more sexual. In fact, there's arguably a couple of like actual sex acts portrayed in the movie. Just another reason this is not really for children. And overall, like I said, lots of gore, lots of blood, on top of just dark themes and dark subject matter. It's kind of a psychological horror movie overall. Like, there were quite a few sequences where it was like, oh wait, this is something that I would see in a horror. So even if I wasn't waiting the whole movie for like a scary thing to happen, and I wasn't necessarily scared while watching it, but there are definitely some very shocking moments and shocking visuals. And this is where I'm a little bit conflicted, because there are definitely moments where it feels like the movie is just being a little bit too edgelordy. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's a line between I'm going to approach serious subject matter in a specific way, and this is just my vision for the work, and then past that line is, oh, I just want to freak people out and have really disgusting or graphic imagery, and that's why I'm doing it. So I guess it comes down to speculating about the original intent behind the work, but then again, death of the author, etc., our own interpretations are valid. And there were definitely moments, I won't say that it was my overall impression, but there were definitely multiple moments while watching the movie where I felt this feels more edgelordy than like it just fits the story overall. And those were the parts that really started to bother me, just because what's the point? If you want to make a big like gross out splatter movie, okay, go ahead and do that. Like, that's almost a different subgenre of its own compared to we're going to talk about some really serious stuff, and you know, the graphic violence and other things like that and scary imagery complements that. And I do think it's very close to that line. I don't think it crosses completely over into the territory of edgelord country, but it's also up to, it's up to everyone else to interpret on their own as well. Obviously, I'm not going to get into heavy plot spoilers. I don't know, even the story itself is not really something that you can spoil. It's not that kind of story. In fact, this is where I can come back to the thought that in certain ways it feels like a short film, because in a short film, whether it's 10 minutes long or 60 minutes long or whatever, you don't have as much much time generally as a feature film to cram in a bunch of story and plot stuff and typical screenplay structure. Depending on pacing especially, you might not have time to hit many plot points at all. And in fact, Birdboy, it really hits a shockingly low number of plot points. It's a very slow-paced movie, and if you're expecting like a grand adventure, that's not what this is. And that's in keeping with the tone and the messaging, I think, is just, it's more about like feeling trapped and restricted and trying to either just survive or trying to do something positive within really objectively negative conditions and circumstances. So because of the pacing and because we don't hit a ton of plot points, and then some of the really actiony sequences feel almost out of place, that's why this felt more like a short film to me at certain moments, because in a short film you can't, it's almost just a proof of concept. You can almost just say, oh, here's some characters, here's an interesting premise, and not really develop everything fully. That's kind of what I felt watching Birdboy. Not everything was explored to completion, so to speak, and whether or not that bothers you, it's completely subjective, of course. But here, there were times where I felt like, okay, this is a starting point. I would gladly see a larger story set in this world and with these characters, but I also have a feeling that it kind of has the structure and pacing because it matches that of the original graphic novel. Because again, in a graphic novel, like a short film, you can have any structure you want. Basically, you can have as much plot as you want or as little plot as you want. You can have really dark subject matter. It can be more oriented towards adult audiences. You can have really fascinating visuals, all that stuff. There are just more allowances offered by that medium. I guess this is really the point where I just need to wrap up, but basically, generally positive feelings about the movie. At the very least, the bare bones reaction is that it's something incredibly different from most of what I've seen. There are moments where the comedy, the juxtaposition of, oh, cutesy imagery and really harsh violence or reality stuff. There were times when that got old. I don't know if that was really justified to have, over an hour of that kind of content. Either way, it is saying something. At the very least, it's putting these harsh realities up for discussion. It's bringing these things to some kind of forefront, I suppose. It's definitely not for kids. Yeah, in fact, I think if this was distributed in the US at all, even if they never said it was for kids, just putting out that trailer, I think they might have gotten sued by some parents, because if you look at the art style, you don't immediately think, oh, this is dark and gritty. You think, oh, it's a kid's movie, dark setting, but whatever. And I think some families or kids would have gone to see it and they would have been extremely surprised at the very least. But that's Birdboy. I'm not in love with it. There are moments where what it was going for didn't really work for me. There are other sequences that I thought were extremely effective, and yeah, there is some relatable stuff in here, probably. If you're a human being, you've ever found yourself in a not so great situation, this definitely captures that feeling, and there's value to that. But I think that's about it. I just have to stop. Thank you for checking out the video, and I'll see you in the next one.